Welcome to the Ask Historians Podcast.
Hello and welcome back to the Ask Historians Podcast. I'm user SteelCan909, once again in a somewhat unusual situation where I actually get to talk about a subject I know something about, rather than just a list of topics that I'm not familiar with. But I will go ahead and let my guest go ahead and introduce himself, and we can dive right on into the topic.
All right, so I am Reddit user Liljendal, or you Liljendal. I'm not sure really how I should describe myself. I'm a filmmaker by trade, or educated as a filmmaker, but got into history from a very early age, especially sort of like local history for me, because I was born in Akureyri in northern Iceland. And it all started with a comic book on Njál saga, which was very well. It had pictures that were like really good, and I still sometimes look at this book and I'm like, they really nailed pictures. Like they captured these sort of like the clothing is majestic, and it really captures the sort of epic feel that the story has. And I was hooked from there on. And then I just sort of got into it. It wasn't until like during college and after college what I started to do a little bit more of my own independent research, and I've been reading up on the sagas and trying to get better into like modern scholarship as well, just to have a feel of, what are the actual experts saying. And I just very enthusiastic about history, and I love talking about it, and hopefully someone is willing to listen and learn something new.
All right, well, let's go ahead then and get started with it, because one of the things that we wanted to talk about today, excuse me, are the perceptions of, in particular, Norse history amongst both modern people in the contemporary sources that were compiled. You mentioned the saga literature, and we'll get into that a good bit as well. When we're looking at this, though, oftentimes today we like to divide up Europe, especially medieval Europe, into different cultural spheres, different cultural areas. And where with the Norse, you've kind of got this Scandinavian, Nordic, North Seas influence. And then that's often contrasted with the more Mediterranean focused, the Latin Christian West, with England kind of as this outlier in between the two, where you kind of have the situation of the quote unquote barbaric Northmen and then the more civilized and Christianized peoples of England and France and the rest of the Christian parts of Europe. And so I wanted to start off with that perception of the Norse as this kind of barbaric outside influence, and how we see this playing out in both contemporary writings and then up through to the modern day.
Yeah, so I believe, as with many things in the Middle Ages, a lot of this comes from differences in faith. Because when the Viking Age started with a raid, well, what people usually say it started with a raid on Lindisfarne in the late 8th century, 792 or something like that. These men that were coming to raid a monastery were not of Christian faith. And it was sort of a divider between the sort of the settled world of Christianity and then the barbaric pagans. It doesn't really matter if the British Isles themselves had not been Christians for like many centuries at that point. Well, perhaps a few centuries. But this, even though these people have common origin, they speak very similar languages, and their culture is honestly very similar in a lot of ways. There was this sort of barbaric divide between them, and it's based a lot on the faith, but also from the perspective of the peoples who are under the attack of the foreign influence. And it's not something that's unique to the medieval British versus the medieval Norse. It happens all over history. So the perspective changes a lot once the Norse began Christianizing, even though the raids didn't magically stop when they became Christianized. got less over time, but the Norse world got Christianized around the year 1000 is probably a good indicator. I think the Danes were Christianized a little bit earlier. The year 1000 is the date that Icelanders got Christianized, and the Norwegians just a little bit earlier, some of the Swedes a little bit later, and so forth. But the warfare and raiding was a staple of the Middle Ages, so this sort of divide comes from the fact that they were different. But were they different in culture, or were they different in perspective? So I think, yeah.
Well, so when we're looking at that, how do you see that changing over the course of history? Because nowadays we have a lot of pop culture perception of the Norse world, of Vikings, and then pop cultural perceptions of the Christian Middle Ages. And over time, how do you see these two changing, interacting, and shifting over the course of however you want to define the end of the Middle Ages or the end of the Viking era and so on, to where we're at today, where there are these more, I don't want to say concrete cultural perceptions because it's always constantly shifting, but this idea of, oh, when I think Viking, I think this. I think medieval Christendom, I think this.
Yeah. Well, I think it's safe to say that Vikings in media, and by the way, when I say Vikings, I really mean the medieval Norse or early medieval Norse, or specifically the early medieval Norse raiders, is a distinction probably many people that are listening know already, but being a Viking essentially means being a pirate. So Vikings is a term we often use for the Norse people, so can kind of be interchangeable with the Norse in a lot of sense. So in this case, pop culture references to Vikings have become very popular in the past decades. If you were to backtrack to 100 years ago, I don't think the English speaking world was as enamored by Vikings and the sort of medieval culture around it as they are today. We have hit shows like The Histories, The Vikings, several different movies, and other TV shows that have all developed into this culture. But what pop culture almost always does when depicting these times is they really focus on the barbaric, and they really focus on the perceptions as written by the English chroniclers of the time. So, is it fair? Well, in certain ways, yes, but in other ways, it's really dependent on how you view these times. Because for the Norse themselves, they would never consider themselves barbaric. And interestingly enough, in the Icelandic sagas, we have distinctions between sort of heroes and anti-heroes, whereas the noble, the beautiful heroes that protect their honor and the honor of others are usually described as being like light and beautiful and something to aspire to be, whereas you also have different heroes like Egill Skallagrimsson and Grettir, who are much more barbaric and dark, have dark features, are ugly, and they are sort of what pop culture tends to imitate. But as with all things, it's never really black and white. So pop culture is mostly focused on this sort of barbaric aspect, if we can put it that way, and for good reason, because Vikings were famous for causing a lot of damages and a lot of suffering. But people should also realize that the Middle Ages were not a very peaceful time anywhere in the world, and warfare and raiding was a bit of a, unfortunately, was a bit of a way of life sometimes.
When we're looking at the Norse and their creation of their own perception in literature and in their own culture, one thing that has stood out to me as I've been looking through things like late antiquity is in the aftermath of Roman collapse, everybody wants to connect their own people's origin story back to the Romans' mythic origin.
Absolutely.
Because you have the very famously in the Greek world, the Trojan War and the Homeric cycle is this, the apex of Greek culture And I mean, I'm sure some of the classicists could needle me with how I'm describing that, but you have very conscious imitation of Homeric epic poetry and styles and so on, even during the Macedonian period with Alexander and his friends. And then the Romans obviously come in and turn all of those Hellenistic kingdoms into parts of the Roman Empire. And they have their own myth making ability where Virgil connects the mythic foundations of Rome back to the Trojan War. You see a similar process that plays out in the rest of Europe after Roman collapse, where the British, oh, we're actually descended from the Trojan War too. There's this guy named Brutus that you've never heard of before, who was definitely at the Trojan War and then came to what is today Britain after that. And you've got the various other figures, including the Norse, who try and claim a bit of this already existing prestigious origin story for their own national origins. And
Absolutely.
I was wondering if you could talk to us a little bit about how do the Norse go about starting to civilize themselves, at least in the eyes of the rest of Europe, through literature?
Well, I think it's first to sort of go a little bit into why these cultures feel that they need to connect themselves to the Greek world and the Trojan War. And I think it goes back to this sort of civilization versus barbarians, because for the Romans and for Virgil, he knows that his city, despite the sort of mythical origin of Romulus and Remus, I think it is. Anyway, it's like Rome named after Romulus. But he knows very well that his city before his time was just one of the Latin cities on the Italian peninsula, and it rose to prominence through warfare and clever diplomacy. But during the time of the sort of Greek Golden Age, during the time of before Alexander's conquest, when you have the Xenophon's writings and the wars, the Persian wars and such, Rome is rather insignificant. So, how do you come to terms with your great civilization that has conquered most of the known world apart from the Far East? How do you come to terms with your great nation that has conquered all of these peoples and are arguably perhaps better, according to some, but you're insignificant when these great peoples were writing their literature and promoting their culture? So that's why you sort of have to have this link to make sure that you are somehow superior to others in your environment, is what I would at least say. It's not too dissimilar from perhaps more modern racist theories like the prevalence of uh, only 200 years ago of viewing someone being Saxon or Anglo-Saxon objectively better than being Celtic, even though it's really similar DNA. So it's this sort of like trying to explain why your culture and your peoples are better than others, and you have to find this connection. And interestingly enough, Snorri Sturluson, a medieval Icelandic scholar, was also a chieftain, a warrior, and a lawyer. Basically, he was the law speaker for Alþingi for a while. One of the most powerful people in Iceland, but he's best known today for his writings. When he is writing both the poetic Edda, the prose Edda, we call it Snorra Edda in Icelandic, so I always mix them up, and also the later Heimskringla, he finds a way to connect back to the Trojan War as well. But he does it in a unique way because he is also explaining the pagan belief system. So, according to him, the ancient Norse gods were Trojan royalty that fled after the sack of the city, and they had founded kingdoms in around Anatolia and what would be known at the time as Scythia, sort of like north of the Caucasus Mountains, or I've forgotten what this area is called right now, but it's a great plain. that
The
was,
steppe,
yeah,
like
the
the
steppe.
area
Yes,
around modern Ukraine, southern Russia.
exactly. Yeah. So Snorri explains how the Norse gods traveled from there up north through some premonition or prophecy that they would become, that they basically should leave and that their ancestors would make great things of it once they do. And he explains how when they come to Scandinavia or the Norse world at the time, they are seen as gods based on their superiorness. Like they are so civil. So the sort of godly connection, he explains, is perfectly natural because they were these noble Trojans, and that they would then mix with the population, and from their language, which interestingly enough, Snorri calls he basically calls them Turks, which is very anachronistic for the time period. But he explains that their Turkish language was the origin of the Germanic languages as well. So it's not just the origin story for the Norse people, it's also an origin story for the greater Germanic culture. And this is not just to sort of come to terms with his ancestors' pagan faith, because at the time of Snorri's writing, Iceland and the Norse world had been Christianized for centuries. And even though the sagas and history usually romanticize the pagan beliefs quite a bit, they still need this sort of official excuse, you could say, to talk about paganism, because if it's rooted in Trojan royalty, then it's okay. You're not defiling your Christian virtues by doing so. And it also brings this sort of imperialist superiority into your people because, oh, just like the Romans, we are also descendant from, in this case, not the Greeks, but the Trojans. But because of Homer's epics, they have become just as famous. So, yeah, it's very similar in a lot of ways to how you describe Brutus coming to the British Isles, which also, humorously, I would find is not too dissimilar from a certain faith in the US claiming that Jesus went all the way over there, because you need to have this sort of familiarity with uh, the things that are important to you.
It's kind of like sneaking the cultural elements of these people in through the back door of the Greco-Roman tradition, giving like a bit of window dressing to it all. When we're looking at this kind of the dichotomy of the civilized Greeks and Romans versus the uncivilized and so on, how do we see that in more recent perceptions, in your opinion, or in how you see these things playing out? Because as you mentioned, you've got things like television shows where they'll often play up the quote unquote barbaric nature of Norse civilization, through various visual signifiers and different types of music and so on. But what about when you're looking at something like scholarship? Is it reflected there at all?
Perhaps not as much in modern scholarship as it once was, but I still think it does so quite a bit, because when we're reading these texts, we and studying history, we do it because it's something that interests us. And I think most people, not just me, also do it because we are find it fascinating, not just the actual text and the history, but also the people that are writing it. So we sort of perhaps factionalize ourselves when we're studying this history. Like, I'm well aware of my own biases that sometimes I tend to perhaps over exaggerate the sort of honorable nobleness of the Norse heroes and sagas, because that's the way they are presented in their own histories. But I try not to let it get away in when I'm writing answers on Ask Historians, for example. But scholarship tends to stay on these lines a fair bit, at least when it comes to sort of like popular scholarship and history. So it's, I mean, we all have biases. And I mean, the ancients definitely had a lot of biases, but some of it does carry over into modern scholarship because we are so ingrained with the perceptions of the text that we're writing, and we forget to branch out and view things as they were from the other sides as well. One example, perhaps, if we're going later, is that here in Iceland, it is very popular among people when you're studying history in high school or earlier to and studying perhaps the Civil War period of the 13th century, known as the Sturlung Age or Sturlungaöld. And it is a piece of history that has the most violence in Iceland, and well, perhaps the most organized violence, because it has battles with several hundred participants rather than several 30, 40, 50 participants like the battles of the Saga Age. So this is the first time in period where you have these organized battles, and the text is littered with stone throwing and using stones as missiles. And people tend to dismiss it as okay, it's not really as grand as warfare on the mainland during the same time in the 13th century, where you have these armor-clad knights charging in, and even earlier of the Romans. And suddenly here in the backwater of Iceland, you just have people throwing rocks at each other because they didn't have any other weapons. But when you look into things, you realize that the histories we have of the 13th century are they are written by contemporary scholars, and scholars that are sometimes eyewitnesses to these places. The majority of the work is written by Sturla Þórðarson, I believe, who was the nephew of Snorri that we mentioned earlier. And he was, for example, present at the Örlygsstaðabardagi, which is the largest battle that we've had in Iceland. So it changes perception, but because it's accurate enough, the events are not dramatized as much. It's much more of an actual history. Whereas when you read the stories of Norwegian kings in Heimskringla, events are very dramatized. You have an account of, I believe it was the Battle of Fitjar, where Snorri, who also wrote Heimskringla, describes the sky becoming black with arrows. Whereas in Sturlungaöld's account of battles, you have exchange of missiles, where there's spears or bow and arrows, and then a lot of rock throwing, and it just doesn't sound as grand. But then you have to realize that rocks are just very easy and have been part of warfare throughout the ages, and the glamorous Romans were no different, because they would use slings. And then we have siege weaponry like catapults and trebuchets, which are basically just hurling big stones. And I did find, just before we started, let me see, if I can read from, it is Dere Militari by, the Roman historian Vegetus, or Pluvius Flavius Vegetus Serratus. And he writes that every single soldier should train stone throwing either by hand or by sling. And then he later on goes on to the importance of being able to hurl stones effectively in battle. So Roman soldiers are decked with the pilum, the spears that they throw at their enemies, and they have trained archers and missile units, but still the sort of military manual really hammers on the point that stone throwing is important and everyone should learn how to do it, whether it's with sling or by the arm.
That does get to something of an interesting, I would say, challenge to perception, because especially in the modern day, with this pop culture depiction of the Norse and Vikings and so on, they are very often highly masculinized. And this gets into the elements of that kind of barbaric, primal, I don't know, it's savage element. And you see this a lot, for example, in History Channel's TV show Vikings, where most of the main characters are sporting six packs and beards and tattoos and all sorts of things that scholars we know are not necessarily, in fact, not necessarily, they're just not accurate, right? They're just not That's just not what the styles of armor and clothing and so on looked like. And so I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about then the ways that we've seen this change over the course of Norse culture, identity, history, where obviously they had their own conceptions of masculinity and what it meant to be a man versus this kind of more Norse aesthetic
Hyper
sense. Yeah, hyper
strong,
masculine.
yeah.
So, can you talk to us a little bit about how do we go from, or first, what does masculinity look like in the Norse sagas and Norse culture of this time period? And then how does that start to change? And is that, and I think actually it's kind of a corollary to that, is that a change that's a reflection of changes in Scandinavia, or is that a change that is happening because of the Anglophone interaction with Norse history, culture, etc.?
Well, to start off, I don't think it's necessarily Anglophone influences on Norse history. Norse history, at least in Iceland, is very much the most popular type is to study the actual text because we are lucky enough to have an abundance of medieval literature. We collectively call this the sagas. It's both the stories of the settlement of Iceland and then the contemporary stories of the Stirling Age, as I mentioned, stories of bishops, and then later knightly stories that were popular, or chivalric stories popular in Europe, became popular as well. We have this vast collection of literature, so that a lot of the scholars actually just study the literature themselves rather than sort of material history. But of course, material history is here as well, but the main focus tends to be the literature aspect of it, because I'm sorry for going on this sort of literature tangent, but it's also part of because the stories were not written in Latin like most literature elsewhere. They were written in Old Norse or Old Icelandic, and they were also written in prose rather than being sort of the poetic nature that you have when you're reading the Iliad, the Odyssey, or the Aeneid, and so forth. So they are much more modern in a sense, these stories. And they put up scenes and they have direct dialogue in places and are quite lively. So it's actually not as difficult to read as you might imagine if you can get through the sort of archaic prose, essentially. So masculinity and the way that is perceived can be sometimes difficult to determine, but in other ways, it's very easy to determine. To start off with, masculinity was definitely a very important aspect of Norse culture. And these sagas mention masculinity a lot. One of the most common ways of slighting someone is to attack their masculinity directly. But the ways that people do that differs from our modern perceptions quite a bit. To start off with, pop culture is very influenced by these like hyper strong men type scenarios, which may or may not be influenced by the likes of Arnold Schwarzenegger in Conan the Barbarian, which is a fantasy, but you can see certain similarities with how medieval stories are made. And one of my favorite examples, even though it's not the Norse world, is the difference between the Braveheart and how the ancient Scots or ancient medieval Scots or how they appear in Braveheart, and then you have the Outlaw King, and suddenly the same setting looks vastly different, but it's both pop culture and both set in the same period, both ahistorical in their own ways, but they look vastly different. So it matters for sure. The masculinity of the ancient Norse was is I'm not sure where to start, to be honest. It's a lot of it is tied to your battle prowess, as might be expected, because it was a society that revolved around battle. But it's also expected that not everyone of high stature is a warrior. So masculinity is also in ways very ingrained with the sort of nobility of one's character. So someone being noble and masculine can sometimes are not really interchangeable. So in that sense, some of the things that would be masculine are also just common things of characters being heroic or noble in essence. So in that sense, being a good statesman, knowing the law, and being essentially intelligent, or perhaps wise would be a better word, is one of the core principles of what makes a good Norseman in those times. So battle prowess can tend to be like, it's mainly focused on the athleticism. So what makes you masculine is not necessarily how many men you kill, but how athletic you are. Because like the ancient Greeks, the Norse don't really distinguish battle prowess too much from being good at sports, essentially. Like there's this in Laxdal Saga, there's this great chapter when Kjartan, who's this Icelandic hero, essentially goes to the court of Olaf Tryggvason, or Olaf the First, I believe, who was responsible for the Christianization of Norway. And while he's in Norway, he goes to a lake or a pond, and he is swimming with other people. Although in this case, swimming is not the way we know today. They're basically just trying to pull each other under until one of them gives up, like school children might do. And Kjartan in this story is he manages to beat everyone essentially. And then there's this unknown challenger that comes to him who looks very promising, and they go at each other for a while, and they are unable to declare a winner. And Kjartan is kind of not too happy about not being able to defeat this person, and then he learns that he was actually fighting against or combating against the king himself, which was not revealed until later. And so in this sense, the story of them going at it in the lake, trying to basically wrestle each other under the water, could have easily also been a story about them battling each other. But to the ancient Norse, the distinction between their prowess in both of these scenarios are essentially the same.
So one question that I
yeah.
wanted to interrupt real quick. Is like masculinity and the ideals of a masculine individual limited to the nobility in Norse culture? Do you have to be noble, of aristocratic birth bearing? Because some of what you're describing as kind of reminds me a bit of Aristotelian virtue in the ancient Greek world, where the farmer on the farm and the peasantry, they cannot be virtuous by definition because they do not have the innate nobility of character to do it. Is that a through line in Norse masculinity as well?
I'm not able to ascertain it for a fact at the moment, but in most cases, I would say yes. It is an important distinction, though, in this sense that Kjartan does not actually have noble lineage as we understand nobility. Like, well, he actually does, but it's a bit complicated. So his father was a bastard child called Olafur Pái, the Peacock, which is also a very interesting nickname I might get into later. But it is later learned because he was birthed from his mother was an Irish slave, essentially, that his father had bought while on a journey in Norway, and then impregnated her before they came back to Iceland. But this bastard son suddenly becomes noble when he realizes that his mother, even though being a slave, is actually the daughter of an Irish king. And while here, like, Irish and Celtic peoples settled Iceland along with the Norse, a lot of them were enslaved and also captured slaves and such. So the Norse may certainly have looked down on Irish people at times, but nobility does not define one's culture. So suddenly you have the bastard child become noble, just because of his mother's lineage, which even to the medieval Icelanders must have been not really believable at times. And then Kjartan's father, Ólafur, goes on this voyage where he meets his own father, the king, and comes back like rich with gear and has been friendly with the king of Norway and such. So he comes back and suddenly he's noble. But in Iceland in general, the sons of wealthy farmers essentially were akin to the lower nobility of the Norse world. So even though they don't have direct descendants of the jarls or kings of the Scandinavian world, they are still noble in essence, and they can trace their lineage back to the early nobility. In any case, like in this example of Kjartan, he traces his lineage to Auður Djúpúða, who was the Queen of Dublin through marriage and the daughter of a noble Norwegian that later settled in Iceland. So nobility is definitely important when it comes to masculinity and this sort of heroicness, because class was everything to the Norse, and if it wasn't class, it was definitely your heritage and your lineage depended a lot. And it was not just for the way you should be treated by others, but lineage also was to the medieval Norse a way in which you would behave and your character would be based on. So the long-winded answer is yes.
Do the Norse sagas then have a view of what the character of those who are not of noble ancestry is then, or is it a collection of different perspectives? It's just that are all kind of not masculine, not virtuous, or is there kind of an archetypal peasant, serf, slave, whatever the terminology that you want to use is?
Perhaps not archetypal in essence, like the sort of more peasantry can be described as being very generous and humble and nice, essentially, because humility was a great virtue for the Norse, despite what pop culture might have you think. But these perhaps one of the archetypes of the peasantry, especially the male peasantry, would be robbers or people that basically have no honor. So in Njálssaga, for example, you have this freed slave that causes a lot of ruckus, and he's essentially just doing it for his own greed. And it's actually a lot of cases of that. So yeah, those who are dishonorable, those who are greedy and willing to steal, murder those that did not illegally, essentially. Murder is also a very difficult thing when it comes to legality. If you're murdering someone in vengeance or in a duel, then it's your birthright, or not birthright, it's your right. If you're just killing someone spontaneously, then it's usually a pretty bad thing, unless the other party offended you somehow and they got it coming.
Again, it's kind of funny. You go back to the similarities between different Germanic cultural groups, where you've got, for example, the Anglo-Saxons and so on, where there is kind of a comparable situation where sometimes, in general, murder is bad. But there's fuzzy areas in there when it comes to responding to insults or vengeance or societal expectation therein. And so that is kind of an interesting parallel between those as well. When we're looking then at the transition away from this kind of the Icelandic vision of masculinity from the early Middle Ages into the High Middle Ages, and then nowadays you have this pop cultural perception of Norse masculinity, kind of again taking Conan the Barbarian and the Hyperborean period, which is pulp science fiction fantasy at its finest. Where then does that go? Is it just the influence of movies and comics and so on like that kind of gives us this pop cultural vision of the Norse?
I think it's mostly just our modern perceptions of masculinity that are being projected on the medieval Norse. Because I did spend some time on sort of athleticism and being a great warrior and such, but being masculine for the Norse was also being very beautiful. And the Norse were quite vain in a lot of sense. Like dressing up in fine clothing was seen as masculine. Dressing up in colorful clothing during basically all eras of from antiquity to the Middle Ages was a stature of wealth. So the sagas, for example, is funnily enough when characters approach from the distance, sometimes they will say they are wearing uncolored clothes, so you know it's not the lesser nobility or the rich. But then suddenly, if you're out on your farm and you see a group of men riding towards you that all have colored clothing, and then you see shields strapped on their backs, you know there's trouble brewing. So clothing is important. And going back to Kjartan's father, who I told wrestled with the Norwegian king, his nickname was the Peacock or Paui. And how does a man of noble lineage gain the nickname of being like a peacock bird? Is because he was very noble, but also because he was very pretty and he wore expensive clothing. His swords would be decorated. He would have jewelry, because jewelry was not just something that was feminine, it was masculine as well. To have jewelry, to have your hair done well, to be washed, to be clean, and to wear, as I said, expensive and fine clothing, to follow fashion essentially was a masculine thing to do. And it's not so when you have pop culture references, usually the masculinity in terms of clothing is sort of bare bones and just perhaps being shirtless or having your hair disheveled and stuff. But that's something that you would connect with the sort of anti-heroes of the sagas, or those that are perhaps not as noble or honorable, but are still heroic because of their great deeds. And so this is the aspect of masculinity that we tend to not associate with the Norse world. Because one of the interesting examples, if we continue with Laxdala Saga, which has Olafur and the others, I want to read, if I can, description of one of the characters called Hrútur. So here is his description in the medieval manuscript. Translation, it's an old translation, so it's a bit archaic in his choice of words, but he was at an early age both big and strong as he grew up, and as to growth of body, he was goodlier, which in this context would mean athletic or handsome, than any man, tall and broad-shouldered, slender of waist, with fine limbs and well-made hands and feet. Hrútur was of all men the fairest of feature, and like that of Thorstein, his mother's father, had been, or like Ketill, flat nose or flat never. And all things taken together, he was a man of the greatest mettle. So here you have a lot of interesting things. One, the story describes in a lot of detail his physique, among other things. And also going back to the lineage, it goes out of his way to say that he was similar to Thorstein, his mother's father, who was the father of Öður Djúpagða, and then the noble I talked about earlier without mentioning him by name, Ketill Flatnose. So those great men carried over into Hrútur, and his great physique shows that he has earned that lineage himself. And then we also have Kjartan, that I mentioned earlier. His description is, he was of all men the goodliest, in this case I would say noble or handsome, of those who have been born in Iceland. He was striking of countenance and fair of feature. He had the finest eyes of any man, and was light of hue. He had a great deal of hair as fair as silk, falling in curls. He was a big man and strong, taking after his mother's father, Egil, or his uncle, Thorolf. Kjartan was better proportioned than any man, so that all wondered who saw him. He was better skilled at arms than most men. He was deft craftsman and the best swimmer of all men. So here again is not just being athletic, but also his silky hair falling in curls and this sort of fair hue around him, which goes back to the sort of light versus dark heroes, because Kjartan and Hrútur as well are definitely of the former of light heroes. And then to top it off, we have description of Gudrun, the sort of femme fatale of the story. She is the one, spoiler alert, that causes the death of Kjartan because they were supposed to be together. He was delayed when he was in Norway, and so Gudrun ends up marrying his foster brother and his cousin. No, they were related and also grew up together, called Potli, and this causes this sort of love triangle and ends up having Kjartan dead. So she is described as the woman that everyone wants, essentially, and that's why Kjartan, the biggest hero in that part of Iceland, was meant to be with her. And so her description is she was the goodliest. I have no idea why this author always uses this word goodliest. In this case, I would say the most beautiful of women who grew up in Iceland, both as to looks and wits. Gudrun was such a woman of state that at all time whatever other women wore in the way of finery of dress was looked upon as children's gewgaws besides hers. She was the most cunning and the fairest spoken of all women, and an open-handed withal. So here, if we compare it to the description of the men, no description of her actual physical appearance comes through the text. And yet she is the most beautiful woman. She is the one that everyone desires, but we have physical description of the men, and we don't have of her. We do have a description of her clothing and her fashion, essentially, so that other women look like they are essentially not nearly as well dressed as she is. But the interesting part is that the way her dress is described is very similar to that of other male characters, often like the Olar Peacock. And the third interesting thing I take from this is that one of the things that is not purely masculine about her is that she's described as being cunning and well-spoken, which is just as much a feminine trait as it is a masculine trait. And also, quite interestingly, is that in Old Norse, there's a descriptive that gets a lot of characters in literature get, which is called, or is described as drengur góður, which just means a good boy, essentially. So someone being a good boy means that they possess the sort of virtues that you want in a man, and in this case, usually humility, wits, and such. But there are also women that are sometimes described as being a good boy, and it makes you wonder, like, in these contexts, it's not necessarily that the women are overly masculine, but just that they share some of the traits that you would find good to have for the men. So I think this sort of challenges our modern perception of masculinity in a lot of ways. In different ways, masculinity for the Old Norse was very similar to what we expect today, like comparing someone to the temperament of women could be seen as unmasculine. In Njálssaga, Skarphéðinn has this wonderful sentence once when his mother is trying to goad him towards vengeance, basically going toward the rival farm to kill the person that had recently killed one of their workmen. And he says, we are not of... I need to find the direct translation of this. Hold on. Well, I don't have the direct quote, but he says something on the lines of, we don't share women's temperament that we get mad at everything. So in that ways, it's much more masculine to be reserved and calm rather than being hot-headed like a woman. And again, something I would think challenges our modern perception of masculinity. So,
Is this indicative of, or are these changes, even between the different saga literature, indicative of changes over time in Icelandic culture? Or are they just different avenues towards like kind of one broad form of masculinity? Where's the why is there both this kind of focus on being able to keep your cool, you're able to, keep your emotions in check, not respond to every single thing that happens, but then also this kind of the at least tacit understanding of things like, well, if you kill somebody in a duel, like they had it coming. That's okay. So like, is this indicative of a cultural shift? Is this just different
I've,
cultural? Go ahead.
yeah, I believe it is indicative of a cultural shift because a lot of these virtues and what is considered masculinity and such are directly come from the societies that the people inhabited. So once um, open warfare becomes a lot less common, once the sort of distinction between classes and nobility changes over time, so does the distinction of what is masculine and what isn't. These sagas are also very glorified, basically the glorified near past of the authors. So these stories are written down about 300 years after they occurred, usually. And it is from the settlement of Iceland. And the authors are sort of seeking the glory of their ancestors. And so, what's masculine in those times? And then later, once the country is settled, once it becomes part of the Kingdom of Norway and later the Crown of Denmark, and the economy starts to dwindle and society becomes much more agrarian. Well, society has always been agrarian in Iceland, but things of masculinity change in tandem with the culture. And I think culture is really what drives our perception of what is of gender roles, essentially, what is being masculine, what is being feminine. So there are definitely these outside influences that influence these ways, like being calm headed, for example, is in a lot of ways a direct response to the Norse ways of slighting each other, essentially. So slighting someone among the Old Norse verbally is a very big offense, something that is not, we don't have anymore in modern society. So back in medieval Iceland, if you were to openly slight someone, you would basically be made I believe, outlaw for 3 years for bad offenses. And if you do slight someone publicly and he actually comes and kills you, he does so rightfully in vengeance because you slighted his character. So being calm and level-headed is also a virtue in essence, so that you are not responding to minor slights too quickly and you're able to show restraint and be the better man, essentially, rather than just rushing to your weapons at any given moment.
In the You mentioned that there's this delay between the events that are being occurred, or the events having occurred, and their being codified into written format. Is
Mhm.
there any indication that there is a judgment or kind of a, oh, look at our ancestors, they were so hot-headed and so, rushing into violence at any moment's provocation, but now that we've settled down, we've become Christianized, we're not as barbaric. This is kind of wrapping it back around to that barbaric versus civilized idea, or were they never really keen on, or is that just wrong? I guess it would be the
There is some essence of it, but it's not very prevalent in a lot of ways, I would say, because it's mainly the sort of Christian authors trying to make sense of some things in the past that they would find to be unchristian or not very noble of others. So violence against other Christians in the sagas are often depicted a little bit differently. So usually, if we go back to the sort of light and dark type of heroes, usually it would be the darker types that are openly participating in piracy, for example. Whereas the lighter heroes will usually, they still need to have their character moments, they still need to have their battles to show their prowess and that they are essentially heroes. But rather than going to get wealth off of by raiding or the innocents, they actually usually fight other pirates or they fight vagabonds and steal their wealth for themselves. Which is interesting because in Norse, one of the early heroes, Gunnar, goes goes to Norway and then gets his hands on a ship from a man and goes what the story calls he goes on a campaign or military campaign. Whereas usually in the sagas you would call them going on a Viking trip. But for Gunnar, because he's noble, he's not a Viking. He's just merely going on conquest because conquest is different.
Conquest is noble, piracy is bad.
Exactly. So, and his conquest is usually, as I said, fighting other pirates. But it's easy when you read this text to think that in the original story he was just going on a Viking raid as any other being. But when it's being written down, it's like, oh no, Gunnar wouldn't do that. He was more noble than that. So he goes on conquest and he is basically just killing the bad people and taking their wealth, which is all fine. And then you also have stories like Eilsaga, who just participates in raids very openly. And it isn't glorified, but it isn't really diminished either. So there is still, like, even among the Christians of the Norse society, they were still very proud of their origins and their ancestors. And they viewed that time as being essentially a very romantic view of their past. So, despite the sort of paganism and barbaric nature versus their Christian society, where suddenly forgiveness is a virtue, whereas in paganized Old Norse society, it was just an eye for an eye, basically, dominated the legal code. So, you have these clashes between the two things, but still, this sort of romantic view of the past really outweighs it in a lot of ways. And usually just find ways to make it different. For example, we have the contemporary stories where things are much more realistic. All descriptions of wounds in battle are like quite realistic in essence. Like there's this scene of a man who stabbed the spear in his neck, and it's not a really big wound. And then they retreat. He sits down, has his back against the wall, and the opponent who struck him, he asks, like, "Did you manage to? Was it a fatal wound?" Or and then he looks at his spear, he sees some blood on it, and he's like, "I managed to strike him in the neck, so I'm sure it was fatal." Whereas in the sagas, you have a character who's fighting against um, several men alone. He's alone fighting against, I believe, 5 or 6 men. It's the saga of Gisli Sursson. And his belly is cut open, and obviously a very mortal wound. But what he does is that he takes his tunic and he ties it together with his intestines and continues fighting. So
Not quite the
so something like that would never happen in the contemporary literature. But to the medieval Norse, both of these could still be true. Because as I've forgotten which article it was, but medieval people tended, when they viewed the past, the further away in the past, the more plausible things could be. Like one of the things that during the Christianization of Iceland is that someone says that, Jesus Christ's miracles are quite unbelievable. But then again, they happened so long ago that who am I to say?
and this is perhaps a little puerile of me, but the immediate comparison that comes to my mind is we're okay with things being fantastical and weird if it happens a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away.
Exactly.
Then you can have lasers and laser swords and faster than light travel and so on. But nowadays, now it doesn't belong to the realm of the real.
Exactly.
We're
And
coming up.
yeah,
Oh, sorry. Go ahead. Go ahead.
I was just gonna say, like, of other supernatural things like magic and magical beings also feature in these sagas, but interestingly enough, they don't feature nearly as much in the contemporary stories, with the one exception being miracles performed by saints or the holy men, essentially.
I know we're coming up on just over an hour of talking right now at this point. So I do think it'd probably be a good place to wrap. And we've kind of come full circle with that discussion
Mm-hmm.
of the civilized and the barbaric, and then wrapped it back around. Is there anything that you wanted to leave the audience listening with? Is there anything that you'd like to either plug, or you just want to make sure that, hey, people should know about this particular thing?
Oof. We have a saying in Iceland: when big questions are asked, answers are few and far between. So, what to end with? I'm just fascinated by these stories because not because it's distant from us, but because when you read these stories, it makes it feel a lot closer than it actually is. You have these differences, like the differences of masculinity and culture, but in essence, it's also just a very human history. You can emphasize with these characters and you can reason with them and why they do these certain things. And you realize that in the grand scheme of things, not that much has changed in terms of human culture. And I think that's true of everywhere you look. Like, it's easy to look at history from antiquity, where slavery is quite common. Um, Conquering different people is okay because the stronger, like, what is the quote? The strong do what they must.
Perish.
Yeah,
The weak perish, the strong and do what they must.
exactly. So it was your fault for being weaker. You deserved it, basically. But despite these differences in culture, when you get to the smaller things, when you get to the micro in the history, you realize that our cultures are still fundamentally very similar. And we share a lot of things from the past as we do today. And also, one of the other areas I like, even though I'm not nearly as well read in that field, is the history of the Crusades, because you have this like grand cultural exchange basically. And you also have these people finding reasons to relate to each other despite their faith differences. And it's something that happens between the pagan Norse and the Christianized British Isles, for example, even though both of them are very culturally similar in a lot of ways. So it's not one thing I would want to leave on, but just if you're wanting to get into history, don't be afraid to get into not just the macro scale, but the micro scale as well. Read the stories of the actual people. Find accounts from the era that you like. If you're into Greek history, try reading some of Xenophon's work, for example. Or if you're into the Roman history, perhaps rather than reading a grand history book, what you could do is just read one of Caesar's notes or conquests. And the same goes for the Middle Ages and especially the Norse. Like, if you are interested in Vikings and the Norse world, then pick up Heimskringla or Njálssaga and just give it a go.
All right. Well, thank you all for joining us, and I'm glad to have you on. And thank you for taking the time. I know it's late for you over there in Iceland right now, so we won't hold you for much longer. But thank you for being on the show, and thank you all out there for listening to it.
Well, the pleasure is all mine. Thank you for having me. And thank you.
You've been listening to the Ask Historians podcast. Please support us at patreon.com/askhistorians. Find more history like this by following us on Twitter and Facebook, and by visiting us at askhistorians.reddit.com and ask hundreds of historians and enthusiasts anything you want to know about history.